Impact Justice. Nonprofit, Bay Area, about 2 years old, very young. We've got a number of criminal justice reform projects under our umbrella. We house the Federal Prison Rape Elimination Act team, so the team that's empowered by the Act of Congress to eliminate prison rape across the country. So they do auditing and monitoring and issue reports and stuff like that. We house the a woman who, thank you parents, whose work is to eliminate children being put on the sex registry in terms of children under the age of 18. So that's one of the projects we have. And we do a lot of data keeping research and that sort of support for efforts like Cut 50 and other things like that. And then we have the Restorative Justice Project, which is my team, headed by Sujata Baliga, who is an amazing teacher and an amazing restorative justice practitioner. And what we do, principally, is we work with communities throughout California and now in the rest of the country, building restorative youth diversion programs. And a diversion program means we get agreements with the district attorney's office and with the juvenile court system in that jurisdiction, usually a county. And they agree to send cases, instead of going through and being charged in the criminal court and the child going before a judge, they get sent straight to restorative conferencing process. So they bypass the juvenile justice system ideally entirely. So there's no charge, there's no record, and if the victim of the crime agrees and the family of the youth who's responsible for the crime agrees, they go to a restorative conference, which we'll talk about, which happens in a circle. It's a little bit more formal than what we just did. And then they come up with a plan for making the harm right. And that plan is going to make right not just the harm to the victim or the victims, but it's going to make the harm right to the community, and it's going to make the harm right to the young person themselves. Okay? And so the plan doesn't necessarily just involve things that the young person is going to do. It can involve things that their parents are going to do. It can involve things that other members of the community are going to do. And then that plan, once there's a consensus, that plan is followed, and if it's completed within 6 months and all the parties agree that it's been complete, then there's no case. That's the resolution of the issue. So that's what we mean by diversion program. Okay, and our model, there's all sorts of diversion programs. Like I said, we're in a moment now where there cities across the country, counties across the country are implementing diversion programs. We only work in pre-charge, pre-booking diversion, meaning there may be an arrest but no formal charges, which makes ours kind of a more relatively progressive, holistic diversion model. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that model. But that's our principal model. We also train in circle process. In some places, especially like more rural places or where restorative community conferencing, which is the conferencing I'm talking about, where that's not yet implemented, we train folks in circle so that they can resolve conflict outside of the court system. And we train that, sometimes we call that off-grid circle keeping, when they're resolving conflict in their communities, but it's not necessarily through agreement in a formal diversion program. So we also train in circle. So those are our two main things, circle process and restorative community conferencing. This is going to make more sense in a minute. So, okay, so the learning objectives for this class I have, all I have is I want to share with you guys the principles and the history of the modern restorative justice movement and an introduction to restorative community conferencing, which is that conferencing model that we do at Impact Justice. Okay, so this is Albert Einstein, who, in addition to being a very smart guy, is a lot of times considered a 20th century guru. Okay, he was a philosopher, he was a humanist, and the reason I've got him up here is because at Impact Justice, our team, we don't think of restorative justice as just a set of techniques or practices. We believe, like I said, and we treat restorative justice as a movement and a paradigm shift in how we resolve harm and conflict. Okay, the quote here from Albert Einstein, which sort of encapsulates the concept of a paradigm shift and where we're coming from with restorative justice is, he said, if we want to solve a problem, and the problem we're talking about really is the punitive criminal justice system, mass incarceration, victims being not satisfied, all these problems that we see with how we're administering criminal justice now. We want to solve a problem. We can't solve it if we continue to think the same way we were thinking when we created it. Okay? talk, and that references something else, which is the lens that we have. The lens that we have. So the book in the middle of the circle here, which I don't know if it was assigned, but you should all check out, it's kind of the Bible of the modern restorative justice movement, is Howard Zer's Changing Lenses, okay? And it's like coming at the idea of harm and trauma from a totally different lens, not necessarily from a bad single actor in a single moment in time, but expanding that lens and thinking about it more community-based and less labeling. Okay, let's move forward. Thank you, Terry. So what do we mean? What do I mean when I'm talking about restorative justice? By now in this class, you can all probably agree that that term is used to describe a lot of things. Okay, it can describe reentry programs. It can describe things like Homeboy Industries down in LA, where they take formerly incarcerated folks and help put them to work and help reintegrate them in the community. It can describe all forms of circle process. It can describe a lot of things. And none of those things are necessarily wrong, but when I'm talking about restorative justice, I'm talking about bringing the person who's been harmed and the person they've harmed or people they've harmed together and having those affected parties themselves, ideally face-to-face, resolve the conflict in a non-hierarchical, community-based process, okay? That's really what we're talking about, the crux of what restorative justice means. So in restorative justice, I'm going to ask you to click it.
No, I'm sorry.
So you're good. It's going to be hard because there's a lot of these slides where it's like, that's one thing and the other, but you're good. So in restorative justice, this is part of the paradigm shift. Our approach in restorative justice believes that crime is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. And those violations create new obligations. So when you violated someone, an obligation is created, okay? And the central obligation is to, as much as possible, do right by the people you harmed. So let's take a look at that side by side with the criminal legal system, okay? And I should make a quick note about language. You've noticed I'm referring to the criminal justice system as the criminal legal system. That's a term that we tend to use in restorative justice circles. I also probably won't be referring to offenders. I would rather refer to the responsible party or the responsible youth when we're talking about juvenile justice. And victim is also a controversial term. We tend to use person harmed because not everybody wants to be labeled a victim, right? And again, expanding our view and not necessarily labeling, you know, in a given conflict, even if one person seems to have obviously harmed someone else, that person might feel like the victim for some reason or another. And so we don't want to put those labels on people. So the criminal legal system approach is going to ask three questions. The first in the criminal legal system is whenever there's been a crime is you ask what law has been broken, right? Well, what's the offense here? What are the elements of the offense? The second question would be who broke it? The third question would be how should they be punished? Those are the primary questions you're asking in our modern criminal justice system. And who can tell me who are those questions? Who is that approach focused on? If you think about it, if you look at those questions, who's being focused on with that approach?
Responsible party.
The responsible party, right? Or the suspect or the right. Now let's take a look at the restorative justice approach answers three entirely different questions. The first question of the restorative justice approach is who's been harmed? Second question is what do they need? And the third question is whose obligation is it to meet those needs? And so these questions are focusing obviously on the person who's been harmed. In the criminal justice system, the victim really isn't central to the process. In fact, you don't really need the victim even participating in order for the process to go forward, and oftentimes the victim is only considered insofar as they can provide valuable evidence or witness testimony. And their needs are certainly not, arguably not central to the process. Restorative justice is a more victim-centered approach, okay? The victim's needs, the victim's defined needs take center stage. Okay, so again, expanding the lens here, we also like to ask three additional questions in the back of our mind when we're thinking about restorative justice, which is, what are the causes? What brought us here? What was going on that caused this party or this young person to do what they did? We don't just look at that singular point in time and assign guilt and blame. We think about what are the causes. Another question is, who has a stake? So who besides this one person, this one defendant, has a stake in the outcome here, or in what happened here? Who besides this one victim has a stake in how they are healed, right? And the third is, what's the right process here, okay? Because even though we have a fairly formal process, there's room for asking the victim, like, what do they want with this process? It's not necessarily one size fits all, even for how the process unfolds. Okay, so trying to get in touch with where restorative justice comes from. And we'll talk about the indigenous roots for a second, but you actually don't need to be from an indigenous culture to understand where the roots of it come from. This is a picture of a stick of gum, okay? When I was 9 years old, I was with my music teacher and my brother in a car driving. I'm from Akron, Ohio. And we stopped at a gas station. I idolized my music teacher. I wasn't raised with a father figure, and he was kind of like a father figure to me, and I wanted to get his attention. So I stole a stick of gum from the gas station we were at. I literally remember this day. It was on Akron Road between my house and Akron, Ohio. And of course I wanted him to know about it, so I like bragged about it when we were back in the car, and he was horrified. I'll never forget his face. He was so disappointed in me. It was like totally like, holy crap, like it hadn't occurred to me that he'd be disappointed in me. And he turned the car right around. We went back in there, and of course, what did he do? He marched me up to the clerk and made me show him the gum, made me say I'm sorry and take responsibility. And that was an uncomfortable, difficult process, but I felt loved, and there was healing there for the actual person I'd harmed, right? I made it right with the person I'd harmed, right? And so we can all relate. We all probably have a story like that, and it was hopefully handled in a similar way by whoever forced you or asked you to take responsibility as a young person. And that's just intuitive. So maybe it was gum, maybe it was lipstick, or there's always the old baseball through the window story that we can all relate to. So again, like, this is intuitive. Like, we all know kind of like where this is coming from. It speaks to our hearts in terms of resolving conflict this way. So, in terms of the formal conferencing model, the real roots of it, of the model that we use and that's being spread throughout California now, is from family group conferencing, which is what they call it in overseas. This is New Zealand. In 1988, the government of New Zealand commissioned a national report, a national study, to study why it was that the native Maori population, which is the indigenous population there, was being, especially juveniles, were being disciplined and sent to juvenile detention at a far greater rate than the white population. That was one of the reasons. And they also just wanted to look at what's going on with our juvenile justice system generally, and a few other problems. And they came out, the result of that was in 1989, the passage of the Families and Their Children Act of 1989, or Children and Their Families Act. I can actually get that. I always mess it up. I want to get you the right thing. You can look it up, obviously, but and the Children, Young Persons, and Their Families Act, okay? And this law transformed juvenile justice nationwide. They completely got rid of their juvenile detention system and replaced it with family group conferencing nationwide. So that now there's only one normal youth prison in the entire country now. So they, over the course of a few years, completely replaced it with restorative process. So all kids, when there's a crime committed, go to restorative process in the first instance. And the racial and ethnic disparities that they've been noticing went way down. And by and large, recidivism has gone way down, and it's been lauded as a very successful thing, which is part of why other countries are taking notice. Like I said, they've only got one normal, what we call normal, like not a special case youth prison in the whole country. And I put Maori traditions here because the Maori people were consulted in terms of what the replacement process would be. And so the family group conferencing model drew upon the community-based systems for resolving conflict that the Maori tribal indigenous people had been practicing sort of off the grid, as we would say, from time immemorial. So fast forward, 20 years later, Alameda County, California.